So what do we mean when we talk about welfare? It's really this catch-all term that could encompass any or all of the following social safety net programs. That could include the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as SNAP, better known in layman's terms as food stamps.
Housing assistance, supplemental security income, temporary assistance to needy families, TANF, which is cash benefits, and general assistance.
Usually it's we're going to reform, or the GOP is going to attack and gut welfare, because welfare is for poor Black people.
It's deeply racialized. It also is a kind of, for example, if you were to say, come over to my house and say, let me borrow your lawnmower. And I say, I don't do welfare. It's a colloquial pejorative for something that's kind of a superfluous giveaway. You sort of don't deserve, but I'm going to give it to you because I'm nice, because I'm benevolent, right?
And so deservingness, I think, is a key component of this. And this has been a very racialized term for decades now. I think we can trace it back a little further than this, but I think it's really important to actually listen to the Ronald Reagan campaign speech, the clip from his presidential campaign speech in 1976, where this notion of the welfare queen really was birthed.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year.
That is the very famous Ronald Reagan quote that really introduced this notion of undeserving handouts to people that are mooching.
That was not true at all, right?
Well, part of that is that the person he's actually talking about, whose story is not quite what he was saying, and it's a very tragic tale. The person's name is actually Linda Taylor, and she wasn't even Black. But the way that it reads, and the way that it was then exploited, because Reagan kind of shopped around that quote a lot, and he used it, he kind of tested it out in his Southern speeches. And then in those speeches, he actually used the term standing in line at a grocery store behind this young strapping buck who was using food stamps to buy like T-bone steaks.
Yeah, he knew what the fuck he was doing.
And buck, if you actually know about the racialized terms in United States discourse and American discourse, buck is a 100% racialized term, meaning like a young Black guy. And usually as it pertains to like threatening or raping white women. I mean, it's fundamental to like Birth of a Nation. The trope of a buck as being a very racialized term is
so he was
set.
He was
and
already
then
sort of
later in the campaign, Reagan would actually change that to a young man. Once it was embedded what he was talking about, he didn't have to be as racialized in the way that he was saying that.
Again, he knew exactly what he was doing. This is a speech that was given, much like his states' rights speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi. You know, we use this metaphor in the episode with the atheist, but it's the language has subtext. It has context. If you come over to my house and you open the refrigerator and I say, have whatever you like, and you take the ice cube trays, we would consider that antisocial behavior, because words have
context. That's clearly not what you mean.
Yeah. And so like Reagan knows this. We all know what this means.
Exactly.
And part of what we try to do on the show is to say, like, clearly welfare has a racist implication, or at the very least, has a sense of undeserved moocherism. Right. And so when I was in church as a kid, I'm going to go on a rant here, sorry. When I was in church as a kid, and there was a really great sermon that was given by Buckner Fanning at Trinity Baptist after we left Cornerstone. He had a whole sermon about the difference between grace and charity. Charity was sort of, in the Christian context, is considered something that you've been forsaken or you've been born poor, that charity is something you give someone. Mm-hmm. Whereas grace is sort of something that God does for you that you don't deserve, that you fucked up. And grace, which is considered in certain Christian circles to be the highest sort of moral order, is something you give someone. The most benevolent. Yeah, because you don't even deserve it. And welfare is a sort of secular version of grace. It's saying that, like, you're a piece of shit, you're lazy, but I'm going to give you welfare because it's sort of the superfluous thing.
It's not even charity. It's not even charity.
No, it's not even charity.
It's the just total giving over of something totally undeserved. And actually, this notion is unpacked brilliantly in the book Dog Whistle Politics by Berkeley professor Ian Haney Lopez, who points out that in modern American politics, there are commonly two broad themes. One is the declining economic opportunity, and the other obviously is race. Hanny Lopez defines dog whistle politics as, quote, coded racial appeals that carefully manipulate hostility toward non-whites. And examples that he gives are things we've often discussed on this show, Adam, like racialized crime reporting, demagoguery about welfare queens or of the food stamp president, and even brown hordes crossing borders and installing Sharia law in town halls and state capitals.
Right.
So, like, this is all part of a political calculus to divide and conquer, right? To exploit and encourage working, middle, lower class white people to support what are clearly self-defeating policies and voting against their own interests because they see themselves as being deserving and others as not.
Right. They would literally rather die than help out a poor black guy.
Right.
Because they've earned it and he or she has not.
Exactly. So the point is obviously producing this feeling or a frustration, a sense that some people, blacks, immigrants, Muslims, women, whatever, are getting more than what they work for, right? More than what they earn, ultimately more than what they deserve. And not only that, but these gains, these handouts, come out of the pockets of upstanding white taxpayers, right? The taxpayers
handouts
that
is a good
do
one
this.
too.
And so it winds up doing this zero-sum game where hardworking Americans, which is always code for white people and no one else, are being taken advantage of by those on welfare, right? Those getting stuff that they don't deserve.
I do want to be clear here because the word racially charged is, I think, useful here because I do think that if this was like, let's say like in Britain where the population of minorities is less, or even like a Norway or whatever, or even if, you know, we woke up one day and this country was entirely white, these concepts would still exist, but they wouldn't quite have nearly the amount of purchase, like on a visceral level, that they would have otherwise. So when Fox News, which they love to do this graphic where it's handout nation, and Jon Stewart used to make fun of it, where a hand comes out, like literally a hand protrudes out of America. It's this like white, proper Christian hand. And it's handing money to like the rest of his country. So it's like really cartoonish. I wish we had a TV show so we could show it, but it's like this hand comes through and it shows you handout nation because we're all just a bunch of mooches. And the whole segment is about people that are abusing welfare. And this is something you see time and time again where welfare abuse is the single most common thing that happens all the time. And people are just mooching, riding the gravy train and not working well. Because the implication is being that while you work, because again, Americans are deeply overworked, right? While you work 50 hours a week at Walmart and you're white, and you play by the rules, that there's this black guy across the street is just living large and going to the grocery store and buying all kinds of shit.
Watching a huge flat screen, feet up, not doing work.
Not doing shit.
And so Trump traffics on this all the time. All the time. In a large part, he got elected because of this. And specifically articulated exactly what we've been talking about during a cabinet meeting back in October. And I actually want to play that clip right now.
We're going to be looking at very strongly is welfare reform. That's becoming a very, very big subject, and people are taking advantage of the system, and then other people aren't receiving what they really need to live, and we think it's very unfair to them. But some people are really taking advantage of our system from that standpoint, and we are going to be looking very, very strongly, therefore, at welfare reform. It's going to be a very big topic under this administration, and it started already, and we have a lot of recommendations that we're going to be making, and you'll be hearing about them.
There's deserved and undeserved poor, right? There's charity versus grace. And that is such an exceedingly racialized dichotomy because, again, he's a white nationalist. So he doesn't do this sort of typical right-wing thing where he sort of says no one deserves it. He is openly, and I think very flagrantly, saying that there is a white contingent of people who deserve it, and that they're actually being denied this because of welfare by African Americans. The interesting thing about Trump is he heightens contradictions. He makes it clear that this is a deeply, because who is these people not getting it versus who are getting it? I mean, it's not really clear, but it's clear based on his previous rhetoric and his fan base. It's very clear what he means by that.
This really fits into this anti-civil rights, almost like a backlash against the civil rights movement that started in the 60s, the backlash, and that has continued today. I mean, that there's this kind of grievance industry. But when Trump speaks, it's so reminiscent, I think, of the famous Barry Goldwater campaign slogan from 1964, which was this: "In your heart, you know he's right." And
Yeah.
if you know anything about the Cold War campaign,
Yeah,
it was anti-civil rights. It was all about this sort of very racialized
It's a way of saying that
dog
you
whistling.
don't talk about it at cocktail parties, but deep down inside,
But
you
deep
and I
down inside, you
both
know,
know that those N-words don't deserve money.
And yet, this idea, which now Trump is trafficking on, of course, this has been done for decades and decades, the idea that the welfare state in the United States is such a drain on the system, right?
Yeah.
That so much money is going to these people who aren't even working, which A, is not true because most people who get welfare are also working. And the social safety net budget in this country, which includes SNAP and school lunches and TANF and the stuff that we mentioned, SSI at the top of the show, the entire budget for those things works out to about 10% of the budget. So far from crippling the federal budget, this is, let's say, take from budget in 2015. 10% of that is that social safety net, and $3.7 trillion, which was spent by the U.S. government that year. The largest expenditures were Social Security at about a quarter of the budget, healthcare at about another quarter of the budget, obviously defense and foreign aid at about 16%, and that 10% for these social safety net programs, it includes unemployment insurance, low-income housing assistance, help with energy bills, programs that help abused and neglected kids. Like, these are all included in this 10% of the budget, which obviously is not the reason why Republicans are freaking out about the budget, which they don't actually care about.
Right.
They just care about taking away these programs.